Aloha. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Jamie, and I'm on the outreach team at the Oahu Invasive Species Committee. We work to keep Oahu safe from some of the world's worst invasive plants and animals. Today, we're going to be discussing one of those invaders, devilweed, aka Chromolaena odorata. We will also discuss native, non-native species, and invasive species, history of agriculture in Hawaii, a little background on devilweed, and what you can do to help. We want to show you a closer look at the impacts of this invasive weed could have on our agricultural industry. Hawaii's farmers have many battles that they face, and we do not want devilweed to be another one. First, let's talk about one of the things that makes Hawaii so unique, and why we have so many species that are found nowhere else in the world. It has a lot to do with where we sit geographically. Hawaii is one of the most isolated land masses on the planet. 70 million years ago, Hawaii was born from volcanic hotspots in the middle of the ocean. Over these 70 million years, new species arrived here in the islands. But because of how far away Hawaii is, it took a long time for those species to get here. And how did those species make it all the way here? Well, they arrived here by the 3 W's: wind, wing, and waves. In Hawaii, we also say manu, makani, and moana. When we think of wind, we think of things getting blown here, maybe by a hurricane or on a jet stream. When we think waves, well, seeds can float on the water and travel around on the ocean. And maybe it's a combination of these two, where they float around on the ocean for a while, get washed up on shore, and then get blown around locally, maybe just a couple miles. And the 3rd W, wing, is how most seeds get spread around. Birds love to eat fruit, and when they do, they swallow plenty of seeds. And then those seeds are spread around when they excrete. Seeds can also get stuck to birds, just like they do to us when we're hiking. And those get picked off and spread somewhere else. Let's talk a little bit about native and non-native species and the categories within them. When we talk about native species, they arrived here without the help of humans, right? By one of those 3 W's. When it comes to native species, there are 2 different categories: endemic or indigenous. Endemic species are those that are found nowhere else in the world. They evolved in that location, so they are unique to it. Hawaii has a very high rate of endemic species, which includes the ohia here. Actually, 90% of Hawaii's flowering plants and 75% of our ferns are endemic. That degree of endemism is higher than any other region in the world. Native species can also be indigenous, which means they are native to more than one place in the world. Like the Alima pictured here, which is native to Hawaii, but also other islands up the Hawaiian island chain, all the way to China. Non-native species are those that arrived with the help of humans. But just because a plant is non-native doesn't make it bad. Plumerias are non-native, but many people in Hawaii love them. And you don't see them taking over areas. Most plumerias were planted by someone intentionally. Canoe plants or Polynesian introductions were those brought on to Hawaii by early settlers. Many canoe plants like palo, coconut, breadfruit, pictured here, are technically not native plants, but they're very culturally important and staples in the Hawaiian diet. So, when exactly does a non-native species start to become considered invasive? Well, when it affects one of these 4 things: our economy, how we make and spend our money; our health, they might spread diseases or more money is spent on medical costs. They affect our environment. They might harm our native species or harm other things in our ecosystems. Or they harm our quality of life. So they change the way we do things or make things a little more difficult. Now, not all invasive species are created equal. Some are worse than others. Some check off all 4 things, and some just check off one. Either way, they're considered invasive. So what makes invasive species so good at being bad? Well, there's a couple things. First of all, they can live in a variety of habitat. They can live just about anywhere. They reproduce quickly. Maybe they make a lot of seeds or a lot of babies in a really short amount of time. They outcompete for resources. So they might use up all the food, all the nutrients, maybe all the space, or soak up all the sunlight. And they lack predators or natural enemies. So for example, pigs in our native forests, they don't have any natural enemies except for humans. There's no wolves or apex predators in our forests to eat them. So that gives them a pretty big advantage. Next, let's switch it up and talk a little bit about farming. Traditional farming in Hawaii used the subdivision of land, the ahupua'a. Large piles of rocks, or ahu, mark these borders, and here oftentimes heads of pua'a, or pigs, were left there as an offering to chiefs. Ahupua'a systems were used throughout the islands, allowing for natural resources to be utilized, Mauka to Makai. Each section of the ahupua'a had a special purpose, and all sections were connected to each other, providing Hawaiians what they needed to live. They utilized areas of forest in the steep slopes of the high mountains called the uka. Open land in the middle had some forests and areas to grow food called the kula. And coastal areas where the fish ponds were located were referred to as the kai. The uka section of the ahupua'a is where the water is collected. Rainwater from clouds is stored like a sponge by all of the plants in the forest. Most Hawaiians lived in the kula section below, but would go to the uka section to harvest trees, make their hale or houses, ba'a or canoes, and collect fruits and plant parts for food and medicine. Streams in the uka carry the water down the mountain to the kula section, where it's used for drinking and growing food. As I mentioned, the majority of Hawaiians lived in the kula section of the ahupua'a, and this is where they grew their crops and had their heiau, or temples. Here they were able to pray and have ceremonies. The water, or vai, that came from the upper forest led into the lo'i, the kalo patches, and also provided water for many other crops like bananas, coconuts, breadfruit, and sweet potatoes. The water continued to flow through the streams and down the lo'i into the kai section, to the ocean. The kai section provided Hawaiians with their prime source of protein, fish. As the water flows through the ahupua'a, it picks up nutrients that feed other kinds of algae and tiny animals that the fish eat. This water finally reaches to the loko'ia, or the fish ponds, and then into the ocean. Loko'ia were built at the edge of the land. They had stone walls with gates called makaha in them. The gates allowed water in, but would keep the fish from getting out. The fish in the ponds eat the algae or the small animals that are feeding on the nutrient-rich water from the kula section. And when the fish are big enough, they are taken out and eaten. It was around the mid-1800s when Hawaii started to experience a lot of Western agricultural growth. Industrial production of sugar began at the Holoa plantation on Kauai in 1840, and the rice crop was introduced shortly after. This style of farming, in which food was produced for profit, was much different than the traditional Hawaiian way of growing what you need for your family to eat and trade. Plantations continued to grow with monocropping, which was a farming technique where only one plant is grown versus a variety of things, and crops like rice, pineapple, sugarcane became staple farmed items. These growing plantations created a high demand for labor, causing workers to come from different countries. Today in Hawaii, we are highly dependent on cargo ships, and we're not growing enough of our own food. It's estimated that about 85% of the food we consume has to be shipped in. And with all that cargo coming into our state, that leaves a lot of room for stowaways and invasive species to be brought to our islands. Growing more of our own food in Hawaii not only helps keep invasive species out, but it helps to keep the money here in our islands. According to the 2012 report titled Increased Food Security and Food Self-Sufficiency Strategy, replacing just 10% of the food Hawaii currently imports would amount to about $313 million, which would remain in our state. This report was written by the state to set forth objectives, policies, and actions to increase the amount of locally grown food consumed by Hawaii's residents. Here in Hawaii, we have about 1.93 million acres dedicated to agriculture, and that's about 47% of the state's total land. In the 2021 Civil Beat article titled Hawaii has a lot of agricultural land, but very little of it is used for growing food, written by Yu Young Jung, says that only 8% of land zoned for agriculture, which totals to about 4% of Hawaii's overall land, is actually used for growing crops. And that doesn't just include food, that includes other crops like commercial forestry and flowers. So while we have enough land to grow food, much of it's sitting fallow. And all of these fallow agricultural lands leave room for invasive species like devilweed to make their way in. About 761,000 acres of these agricultural lands are used for grazing livestock. And devilweed can be a big problem for pasture lands like these. It's a pest that if it infests our pasture lands, it can actually make the livestock sick if they eat it. If you want to check out and see what other crop lands we have here in Hawaii, we'll have the website linked in the description below, so you can check out this cool map that the state provides. People are constantly coming in and out of Hawaii, and with that comes some unwanted stowaways. The Hawaii Department of Agriculture has the huge task of inspecting all of our agricultural products, including live plants, seeds, animals large and small, and they look for harmful fungi or bacteria that can cause some major crop losses. It's impossible to catch every single stowaway, and sometimes unwanted species make their way in. The Plant Pest Control Branch is the branch of the Department of Agriculture, and it eradicates, contains, and controls pests of plants which could cause some significant economic damage to agriculture, our environment, and our quality of life. In an effort to reduce the spread of new pests or diseases that have become established in Hawaii, they regularly put out new pest advisories for the public to be aware of. Keeping up with these pest advisories is important, and you can do so by visiting the link that we will link in our description below, but is also here on the screen. Now let's switch gears and talk about the highly invasive plant devilweed. It's one of the world's worst 100 invasive alien species. It has a large native range spanning all the way from Florida and southern Texas through Mexico to South America and even the Caribbean. This aggressive invader has now been introduced to tropical Asia, West Africa, parts of Australia, and Hawaii. Like many invasive species, devilweed reproduces quickly, creating over 800,000 seeds a year, and those seeds are easily distributed by wind and are also great hitchhikers. So what are some of the negative impacts of devilweed? Well, devilweed aggressively infests pasture lands, and once it's established, it can be very costly and labor intensive to get rid of. It forms monocultures, reducing biodiversity. So it creates an area where it's basically the only thing growing, and that's not good for our ecosystems that thrive off of native biodiversity. Like I mentioned, it's also toxic to livestock. So while it infests pasture lands quickly, cows can't eat it and survive off of it. They actually end up getting sickly. It has high amounts of essential oils in the leaves, which increase the fire risk for this plant. And it consumes a large amount of water and actually negatively affects the soil nutrients. Devilweed was first detected on Oahu in 2011 at the Kahuku training area. And right away, the Army Natural Resources Program jumped into action, setting up survey buffers, removing plants, and implementing control measures. With such a large area to survey, the Army Natural Resources Program partnered with OIS to get more personnel in the field to pull plants out of the ground. After the Kahuku training area detection, an area in Kahana Valley was detected about 20 feet off of a main trail in 2013. And a short time later, devilweed was detected at Schofield Barracks. Given the distance and topography from KTA, it's unlikely that this population resulted from wind dispersal, but rather from human activities. Aggressive management by the Army Natural Resources Program and OISC has worked at suppressing plant abundance regionally in these initial areas. But both long range and local dispersals have overwhelmed available resources. The Army Natural Resources Program continues to manage the infestation at Schofield Barracks, along with OISC managing at the KTA Kahuku motocross track on Oahu's North Shore. We also continue to work on the infestation in Kahana Valley with hopes of a localized eradication there. However, over the past 5 years, a large area in the Pukea Palmalu Forest Reserve has become infested, and the numerous smaller populations have also been reported across the island. This combination of increased detections and limited staff resources is making island-wide eradication of this species unlikely.
It's a major problem for us.
Now let's hear some personal stories from a few farmers in Africa that have dealt with the impacts of devilweed.
It's a major problem to us.
What the weed has done to livestock is that it has competed with most of the vegetation that animals feed in and suppressed the density of pasture significantly.
In the beginning, we had a lot of livestock, but with time the number has declined because the cattle have been dying.
Chromolaena affects families and the community generally in that it has spread so much that most areas where people try to plant any other crop find Chromolaena establishes faster, and then crops find it very hard to grow. So it makes the land not so useful in crop production.
In the beginning, the maize used to be healthy, the soils were fertile, but now with time the soil fertility has gone down and the yields have declined. We are not able to control this weed because it's very aggressive.
So we don't want to see devilweed invading pastures here on Oahu, just like it has other places. So we're working to spread awareness and contain the spread of this plant. We want you to be able to identify devilweed. So let's talk a little bit about its defining characteristics. In general, this is a shrub with long, rambling branches that often appear lit. The leaves have toothed edges and are triangular in shape. And they have a characteristic devil's pitchfork in their veins. The leaves are attached opposite of each other and their leaf stems are naked. And even the new leaves on a devilweed are triangular in shape and have those same characteristics. Flowers on devilweed are pale pinkish and white, and they form in clusters. And once they turn into seed heads, they are brown, clustered, bushy, and fuzzy, and they can be blown around sort of like a dandelion, very easily dispersed in the wind. We also have a video on our YouTube channel that I'll go ahead and link here. It includes a closer look at identification of this plant. Now let's discuss some fun trivia about devilweed. Some just interesting tidbits I thought I'd mention. Well, did you know devilweed is in the same family, including sunflowers? The family Asteraceae, which contains over 32,000 species. There are some medical uses for devilweed. However, there are native Hawaiian plants that also provide the same medical benefits and don't cause damage to our ecosystems. When the leaves are crushed, they actually have an odor that resembles gasoline. And in some people, it can actually be an irritant. It can cause irritation to their lungs or to their skin. And lastly, it actually inhibits the growth of other plants around it. So what's being done to fight this invasive species? Well, OISC and ANRP are still working to contain this plant in the Kahuku training area and in Kahana. Our crew does regular visits and camping trips focusing on removing the plant to contain its spread. We have a community-led volunteer program called the Devilweed Crew, where volunteers pick from a list of trails they survey, and they survey for devilweed in their free time. With that program, we'll send you a free devilweed ID kit so you're able to identify devilweed in the field. Also, biocontrol options are being explored. It is a small gall-forming fly, that's what's pictured here on your screen, that mates on devilweed and lays its eggs in the buds of the plant. This creates a gall, which slows the growth of the plant, reducing flower and seed production. This biocontrol has been successfully introduced in several countries in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific with positive test results. In Papua New Guinea, where devilweed is a major agricultural pest, crop yields actually went up as much as 50% after the introduction of this biocontrol. So what can you do to help? Well, things you can do are report any suspicious plant or animals that seem out of the ordinary or maybe you don't recognize. And you can report them to 643pest.org, or you can download the 643pest app. You can volunteer. Volunteering is a great way to help get rid of invasive species if you volunteer with an organization that removes them. You can find volunteer opportunities like that and more at conservationconnections.org. And one of the most important things you can do when you hike, go off-roading, or move equipment from one location to another is be sure to decontaminate your gear or equipment. Brushing off all the mud and debris and removing any leftover plant material. This helps to keep invasive species from spreading. And if there are ohia in the area as well, be sure to finish with a spray of 70% alcohol. This will help from spreading rapid ohia death. All right, that wraps up our presentation for today. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to learn about this invasive pest and how it can affect our agricultural and pasture lands. If you want to get a hold of us, you can use the contact information on the screen, including our social media handle, which is @OahuISC. Mahalo.